And now, without any further ado, our presenter, Wendell Karsen. Wendell, on behalf of us all, thank you for 3 already, and I'm sure today as well, outstanding and extremely informative presentations on the church in Southeast Asia and politics as well.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Did you all get a cookie on the way in? They looked pretty good. I didn't succumb to the temptation, but anyway, we'll see. So today we move on to our last subject for this series, and that is Indonesia. Indonesia is down here in terms of the whole of the world map up to here. And at first it doesn't look all that big, but it's pretty big. It's now you can see better. It's the Sumatra, the biggest island, and one of the biggest in the world is there. Kalimantan used to be called Borneo, and this belongs to Malaysia, East Malaysia, and the rest belongs to Indonesia. And there's always been some tension about that. And then this is the main island of Java, where most things have taken place, in the capital, Jakarta is there. Then Bali, you've heard of, little island here, and so on. And these, we'll see later, the Spice Islands, over to New Guinea, up to Papua New Guinea. Now, it's the world's biggest island country, and it has 17,508 islands. I have not counted them myself. And of course, many of them are not inhabited. They're just little tiny islands, but it's an enormous, 14th largest country in the world, and it has 38 provinces. So if you put it across the United States, excuse me, it is pretty wide, in terms of population. In terms of demographics, it has 279 million people, which makes it the 4th most populous country in the world. And there's 1,300 ethnic groups with 700 languages. Would you like to try and govern this place? We'll see why that's complicated. So you have people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, in a sense, there in that country. As far as the religious scene is concerned, 87% of the population are Muslim, which makes it the largest Muslim country in the world. Now, most people would think that would be in the Middle East, but that's not the case. It's in Indonesia. Excuse me. There's a long history behind that. The people from India first invaded this archipelago way back at the time of Christ, and had a number of empires there for 700 years. And then the Muslims invaded in the 8th century and drove out the Indians, except for a few that escaped to Bali, and we'll talk about that later. 10.5% Christian, Protestant 7.3%, Catholic 3.06%. 1.7% Hindu, and that is because the refugees from those Hindu empires all fled the courts of the different Majapahit Empire, fled to Bali, and were safe there. So today, most of Bali are Hindu. They're not Muslim. And then there's 0.7% Buddhist, most of those, of course, being the Chinese that are part of the population. So here you see one of the many, many, many mosques over the whole country. The motto of the country is unity in diversity, which is rather interesting. Unity in diversity. Of course, they have to have that. When you just saw the number of different peoples and languages and spread over all these islands. And they have a constitutional framework called Panchasila, which means 5 principles. First, theism. Interesting. It's a theocratic society in the sense that their citizens are required to believe in God. Now, you may have your own interpretation of who God is, but that you should believe in God. Second, nationalism. Third, internationalism in terms of foreign policy. Fourth, democracy. And five, social justice. The mythological bird is the Garuda bird. Maybe you've heard of Garuda Airlines. That's the Indonesian airline. And it's named after this bird. And the symbol in the middle, we'll talk about. The star in the middle means there's one God. The tree that you see in the upper right-hand corner is the nationalism. So it's the local roots of the tree. That's the symbol. The chain on the lower right-hand side represents internationalism, that they want to be a part of the world community. The bull on the upper left-hand corner represents democracy. And the rice and cotton below that represent the social justice. And the Garuda bird is actually patterned after the Javan hawk eagle. So interesting. We have an eagle as our national symbol. They have an eagle as well. It's just a different species. The government is a presidential constitutional republic. Executive, it's really kind of similar to our system. A president, vice president, and there's 5-year terms. And they have a legislative branch with the People's Consultative Assembly. Then there's an upper house, regional representative council, and a lower house, kind of like the Senate and the House in our system, People's Representative Council. And then the judicial branch. They have a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice, and they have the world's most complex and biggest election, 205 million voters. So that gives you a view of the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, I should say. As far as the economy is concerned, it's the 7th largest in the world. GDP is 4.7 trillion and 16,843 per capita, which is low in terms of the US, but pretty high in terms of Asia. They have 43.4% of their economy is involved in services. A lot of that would be tourism, and so on, hotels, etc. And 39.7% in industry and 12.8% in agriculture. Main exports, palm oil and coal briquettes. You would say that's a main export, palm oil. Palm oil is like the peanut. It has a lot of uses, and it's in high demand in the world, which is a problem, and we'll see why. Main imports are petroleum, telephones, vehicle parts, and wheat. And the exchange rate is 16,000 rupiahs to $1 US. So when we went to Indonesia as missionaries, we were millionaires. And you had to carry your money around in a paper bag sometimes. The climate, well, here you see a palm oil plantation, and we'll see in a little bit why that's a problem. As far as the climate is concerned, the geology and biodiversity, it's tropical and lies along the equator. And they have a dry season, May through October, and a rainy season, November through April. Let me tell you, when it rains, it rains. It's like Noah's flood. And that's because the wind actually changes directions. For part of the year, the dry season, it blows from the equator, and then from the wet season, it comes from Australia. And Indonesia has many, many volcanoes, 400. So it's called the Ring of Fire because there's almost always some eruption of a volcano somewhere. Some of them are very dangerous, like on Bali, the Agung, Mount Agung exploded and killed about 10,000 people some years ago. Oh, sorry, this one. It's got 1,531 species of birds. Part of the problem with that is that the Indonesians love birds, and the Chinese do, and they like to capture them and keep them in cages. So some of these species are endangered because people love to have birds singing in their house or their backyard. And it has 515 species of animals and the world's fastest deforestation rate. So there you can see the preparation for a palm oil plantation. Because it's so lucrative as an export, so they're cutting down the forest. The government has rules about this. They have rules about burning, but enforcing those rules is another matter. And for years, the neighbors, Singapore, Malaysia, especially, and others, have been covered in smoke at certain times of the year that from all of these fires from Indonesia. So it's an ecological problem. And of course, we're losing part of our lung as this forest comes down, like in the Amazon, for example. As far as education is concerned, compulsory through grade 12. And you can choose public or private schools, which is a big controversy here. I don't know why, because in the Netherlands, they have per capita, grant for families, and you can go to a private or a public school, depending what you want to do. Here, it's a big subject. Primary school, 93% have had a primary education, 79% of secondary education, 36% tertiary education, which is pretty good for an Asian country, 96% literacy rate. So it's a really excellent place in terms of education. So I took this picture and all these kids were happy as all get out that their picture was being taken. And a lot of them put up a peace sign and so on. Healthcare. They have national health insurance as of 2014. That's another sore subject in this country, which it blows my mind. But anyway, they have a national health insurance. Rising life expectancy, the average now is 71.7 as of 5 years ago. That's the latest figure I could get. Declining child mortality, 24 per 1,000. And they have still issues. We keep selling them tobacco, so they keep smoking. And other Asian countries like China as well. Air pollution from, as I said, burning of the forests and so on. Diseases and malnutrition is still a problem in some of the areas of the island. But they have, these modern health facilities like this one in Jakarta. Unfortunately, it really caters to people who can afford to pay the bill as over against the national insurance. So everybody has some health coverage, but they don't all get into these kind of facilities. Transportation, Southeast Asia's first high-speed railroad. We're still arguing about ours. And they had 337,000 miles of roads, and they drive on the left. So the greatest compliment I ever had in Indonesia when I would take people to church in what we called the Jesus Mobile was that you drive just like an Indonesian. And people would ask me, well, what side of the road do they drive on? I said, well, I don't know. They haven't decided yet. Especially the motorcycle folks. Now, why am I interested in Indonesia? Well, first of all, because of VOC, Vereniging Oost Company, which was the Dutch company, Dutch East India's company. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. They first came in 1602, and most people think the Dutch Indies were ruled by the government of the Netherlands. That's not so. The company actually ran the country from 1602 to 1799. And the Dutch eventually would rule for 350 years altogether. But the company, just like the British East India Company, they had their own military, they had their own bank, and they ran things. And sometimes to the better, and a lot of times to the worst. So here is what started the whole business from Europe is up in there. You see the Molucca, you see that up there, Molucca? Those islands were called the Spice Islands. And once the Europeans found those islands and started using those like cloves and so on, there was a huge scramble of European powers, including the Portuguese, who came in 1512 and were there to 1602 in the Moluccas. So the Dutch drove out the Portuguese. And here you see those Spice Islands. The spices were worth more in Europe at that time than gold. So there was this huge competition to control these. The Dutch were a very small country, but they had a big navy. And they had a very powerful navy. And it would surprise you, probably, I don't know, you may know all this, but the Dutch ruled Taiwan, as we saw, for 25 years. They were in Brazil, the first Europeans in Brazil, and couldn't hang on to that. The Portuguese took it away from them. There was the whole of the Dutch Antilles in the Caribbean, or the West Company. And then, of course, there was Hollandia in this country, which the capital was New Amsterdam. And that was a lot bigger than a lot of people realized. It comprised the whole of New York, New Jersey, some of Pennsylvania, and I think a little bit of Maryland. So it was quite a large colony, and they eventually lost to the British, who changed the name to New York. And they were the first to land in Australia and plant the Dutch flag in Australia, and didn't succeed in holding on to that. But the Tasmania is a big island off of Australia that's named after Abel Tasman, who came from the Groningen province, where all my grandparents came from. And I saw the tribute to him in his home village. He was the one that discovered Australia and Tasmania, which is named after him, actually. And the Dutch tried to take Macau from the Portuguese, but a lucky shot from the fort hit their main ammunition ship in the harbor and blew half the fleet out of the water, so they didn't. And there's a monument to the defeat of the Dutch in Macau that I took my wife's picture at, because she was born in the Netherlands. So the Dutch were all over the place in terms of a small power, but they were a mighty maritime power. So they fought 2 wars with the British and defeated them and so on. This guy was the first kind of governor for the Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC, Jan Pieterszoon Coen, C-O-E-N, Governor General. And he was there for 5 years, 1618 to 23, and then again 2 years later, 4 years later, 1627 to 29. He was a ruthless man, and he invaded Banda Island and massacred the 2,800 inhabitants there and replaced them by slave labor from other islands to make way for Dutch spice planters. At one time, they burned a lot of the clove groves to force the price of clove up in the European market, and it ruined the local farmers, well, slaves. So the history of the Dutch in Indonesia, I'm sorry to say, because there are some here of that kind of ancestry, was not really great, as we'll see. There were 1 million slaves in the 17th to 18th century. Slavery was abolished in 1860, but continued in the outer islands until the 20th century under the Dutch. And here you see some of the photographs. This, if you look carefully, you can see all the bodies hanging from, that was a mass hanging conducted by the Dutch to keep down the local population and so on. Now, people usually think, oh, the Dutch East Indies, that's the same as today's Indonesia. No. If you look carefully at this map, what they had in 1800 already was just these red areas in Sumatra here in Java and in Borneo, just the tip. And then the Moluccas, of course, because that's where the spices were. And then they added by 1870 the orange area, a big swath of Borneo, another island here, the middle of Java, which became really the main focus of the Dutch. And then by 1942, all the yellow, the rest of Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, New Guinea, and Bali, and all these islands. They didn't conquer Bali until 1902. And there were 9 Hindu kingdoms there, very small royal houses who I had told you fled there. And it was called the Pupatan, which means massacre, because the Dutch were heavily armed and they and the Indonesians knew they had no possible chance against that. So they all came out, these royal houses dressed in white, and the Dutch shot them all down. So this is what the ancient Batavia, as the Dutch named the capital, looked like. And today you can still go there and see the main administration building, which is a museum in what is today Jakarta, used to be Batavia. Well, the Dutch lived in high style in Indonesia. This was the governor, and this was the governor's mansion. You can still visit that in Bogor today, which is in the middle of a botanical garden. And but there was a lot of protest and uprising and resistance against Dutch conquest. In 1740, the Chinese and native had an uprising. In 1821 to 38, that's what, 17 years, was the Padre War. In 1825 to 30, that's 5 years, was the Java War. In 1859 to 63, that's 4 years, was the Banjarmasin War. In 1873 to 1903 was the Aceh War, which is at the tip of Sumatra. 1907, several revolts. In all these wars, which you see here, the Indonesians surrendering in the Banjarmasin War to the Dutch, there were 3 to 4 million deaths in these wars and uprisings. So the Dutch ruled through military might, and this was what the factories looked like with these slaves working and the Dutch supervisors. So they had, in the history of the Dutch control of the East Indies, 4 systems. 1602, Holland first. Take out of there everything you can get to build up the Netherlands. In 1830, the cultivation system. Huge Dutch estates squeezed the maximum out of colonies to save the Dutch from bankruptcy after the loss of Belgium. And that's when Java became way overpopulated. And today this is still a problem in Java and Bali and a few islands, because the Dutch wanted to increase the population to work on these plantations. 1870 was the liberal period, allowed the, quote, natives to own property for the first time, run private enterprises, and sell crops. 1901 was the ethical period. Finally, the introduction of education, healthcare, and local administration. But we'll see even that was extremely limited. So by 1930, only 6% of the nationals out of 30 million in Java were literate. So I'll say that again. Oh, no, no. My wife is trying to run the show back there. By 1930, only 6% of the nationals on Java out of 30 million people had an education, primary. 1940, only 240 native high school graduates and 37 college graduates after all this time. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. So the Dutch lived very well. And here's a Dutch household with their servants and so on. This is the Grace Reformed Church that you can still see in Jakarta, the capital that was built 100 years ago or more. And what the people then looked like. So now you had the Dutch East Indies. As I said, by the early 20th century, they controlled that much territory, and it was a big thing in the Netherlands. That was their main possession of many still around the world. But then in 1941, the Indonesian was invaded by the Japanese during World War II, and the Japanese, well, we'll say a little more about that later, but the Japanese, invaded a lot of Asia. And from the standpoint of the nationals or the natives, whatever you want to call them, liberated these countries from colonial domination. And of course, eventually their administration was worse than what they had had before, but still, here they said these Christian nations are fighting each other in Europe, and they have been trying to control you. So the whole seeds of the post-colonial era were sown at that time, so that by the end of World War II, all these countries were seething with ambitions to become free of their colonial masters. In 1947, after the war, the Dutch had no idea of giving independence to the Dutch East Indies. So they re-invaded the country from Australia, where they had regrouped. And there were 110,000 Dutch troops that assaulted the islands. And they tried to retake the Dutch East Indies. But there was a lot of opposition from the other countries in the world that were moving to end colonialism. But during this war, 6,000 Dutch soldiers were killed and 150,000 nationals were killed. Merdeka means independence, and that movement was already growing and very strong during this whole time of the Dutch thinking they could come back and resume what they had before. So in 1949, the Indonesians declared independence. Now, what about the church? Well, does that look familiar to you who are in the Reformed Church in America? Andrax Macht. It's kind of like the slogan for Indonesia: in unity there is strength. In 1830, you remember David Abiel was the first RCA missionary to China, but he didn't go there to establish the RCA mission in Amoy till 1842. Well, in 1830, The RCA sent him to China, to China, to Canton. Today it's known as Guangzhou. To Canton to work amongst seamen, in the seamen's mission there. And so he was already in China in 1830. In 1834, the RCA asked him to do a survey of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies to see where they could establish a mission. And what they decided on, after his reports, was to go to the island of Borneo. Part of it was because the Dutch administration did not want them in other parts of Indonesia. It's like the British too. They resisted. The first English missionary, Robert Morrison, had to sneak into China by going to America and coming on a ship from the United States, and then secretly starting mission work while he then worked as a translator for the British East India Company. Because the business people did not want these missionaries mucking about and stirring things up. So same but the Dutch finally said, okay, you can go to Borneo, which was a pretty wild place in those days. So they established a mission, the RCA, in Pontianak, here in Kalimantan province today, but it was Borneo, this whole island. Was a very complicated undertaking. They sent Albert and Maria Devius there, and Eleanor and Elihu Doty, William and Josephine Youngblood, Jacob Ennis and his wife, and Azuba Kandik. I actually remember somebody named their kid, their girl Azuba. Well, they had a complex mission and really probably tried to spread themselves too thin. First, they were some of them were doing a mission to the local Dayaks, who were kind of cannibals really in the interior. And then some of them reached out to the Malays, and then some of them reached out to the Chinese. And from 1839 to 1852, that's 13 years, we sent 18 missionaries there. Most of them and their children died. So eventually the mission failed and was closed in 1852. So that's the second reason. The third reason is the lady sitting right there, and why I'm interested in Indonesia and her family. We were married in 1950, no, we were married in 1991. And my first wife had passed away in 89. And her mother's on the right, and her Dutch uncle, because her father had passed away, and my parents are on the left. But this is what her mother looked like as a little baby, because her grandfather and grandmother went to Indonesia in 1911, to the Dutch East Indies, I should say. And then this is what her father's family looked like. He's in the back to the right is her father, Johannes Greve. And they also had gone there in 1911. And I should go back. This grandfather, oh, yeah, no. No, I didn't want that. Make it way over there. Well, something is messed up here. Yeah, but I'm trying to go back, but it's not going back. Oh, no, I'm way to the end. Okay, screen sharing has stopped as the shared window is closed. What does that mean? No.
Click the X on there, because you don't want to stop and try to get a certain slide. Just click that X. Fine. Okay. Okay, now find the slide where you want to start by looking on the side there.
Yeah, but I gotta get rid of this, okay. Oh,
Hold on, I got it. You want to play the video?
no,
No, we want to get the.
something happened and that went haywire and I'm way off. Sorry.
Okay, so which slide please?
Way back. Yeah, I can find it. Yeah. And now it went to the end again. I gotta get to where the heck is the other.
There you go, slide that up, slide that up.
Yeah. Part of the problem is arthritis. Oh. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, okay,
Right here?
just about.
Hold on. Is it Mike? Are you seeing, what are you seeing back there?
I'm seeing the far.
Not this way? Okay. Whoops. Yep, okay, there you go. You're good. Here, try using the for advancing that. No.
No. Okay, here we are. Sorry. Thank you, Hannah. So her grandfather, named Van Leeuwarden, he began the first automobile business in Indonesia. And he was invited to this country by Henry Ford for 6 weeks and offered a position in the Ford Motor Company, which he turned down. He wanted to stay in Indonesia. And her grandfather, Greva, on this side, he was in business, but he was also a lay preacher. So they were there in 1911 already, the roots of the family. Then came 1942, the Japanese invaded Indonesia. They took all the men off of Java and other places and Europeans and sent them to work as slaves building the Thai-Burma Railroad. And her father was one of those. And then he was sent to Japan to work in the coal mines. And he almost died, but he received enough medication from the Red Cross to recover and go to Australia, where the Dutch regrouped after World War II. He was in the Dutch Air Force. And her mother was in concentration camp along with the children and sisters and so on for 3.5 years. They reconnoitered in Australia after the war, and her mother and father got married there in Melbourne, Australia. They went back to Indonesia, which by then, of course, was seething with desire for independence. So it was a tough place to be. Her sister Hannah and her brother Garrett were both born, one in Jakarta there and one in Bandung on Java. And this one was conceived there, but she was born in the Netherlands. And she's sitting over there. So then the fourth reason is because we were called, we didn't ask, but we were called to go to Medan, which is here on Sumatra in 1998. And the first thing we were asked to do was to help the Wesley Memorial Church in Medan, which is a Methodist congregation. The Methodists in North Sumatra are the main church there. So we were there for doing preaching and visiting villages, and Reska doing a seminar on music for children in schools. And then we were sent to Bali, which is here. And everybody thinks, oh, you went to paradise. Yeah, just like Hong Kong, you know, there's two sides to the postcard. Bali, if you're in Nusa Dua, in that part, it's got all these huge resorts and a lot of wealth pouring in and so on. You go visit the villages, and you get the other side of the postcard. People are very poor, and so on. So this is a unique place in the world. It's called the Bukit Dor, a hill of prayer. And the Indonesian government recognizes 5 religions. And so if you look way to the end there, you'll see a Muslim mosque. And then the next structure is a Roman Catholic church, because they, just like most Asian countries, distinguish between Protestant and Catholic. They don't say they're both Christian, 2 different religions. Well, we know differently, but that's the way, historically, the way it is. So a Roman Catholic church. Then a Buddhist temple, which you can see here. And then the Protestant church, the KKBB, the Protestant Christian church in Bali has Reformed roots. Hendrik Kramer, if you know that name, was a famous missiologist. He did a big study on Bali in terms of indigenizing the Christian faith and contextualization and so on. This is what the inside of our church looked like. And we started with 4 people. There was an Indonesian congregation, of course, worshiping there, but the bishop wanted to start an English-speaking service as well. And we had 4 tourists. I said to Renska the first Sunday, you'll enjoy my sermon. You're the only one's going to be there. And we had 4 tourists that came up to us walking in saying, is there an English service around here somewhere? We said, come in. And so from that point on, this is conducting a Batak wedding. The Batak tribes are in North Sumatra, and many of them are in influential positions in the government and the military. And we had a couple in our church in Bali who wanted to get married. So that was what that looked like. By the time we left, we had organized the church, the English-speaking congregation with the ordained leaders and so on. And then, of course, we were delegates to the G20 in Indonesia in 2022. And we had our picture taken with the president of Indonesia. If you believe all this, you will believe anything. It so happened that when the G20 met there that year, we were in Indonesia several times after this. And the lady on the right and her husband, way on the left, were members of our congregation. And her university was holding a graduation ceremony in the hall of the building where the G20 was to meet the next week. So that's the true story. Well, let's go through who ruled Indonesia after the Dutch. 1945 to 1967, Sukarno ruled for 22 years. He was one of the few educated nationals that the Dutch had allowed to have an education, and graduated from university with an engineering degree. And the Dutch always feared anybody with education. That's why they suppressed it. But he formed a party to work for independence in 1927. He was jailed by the Dutch from 1930 to 34. And then they exiled him to a far island from 34 to 42. So he was really out of commission, you might say, publicly, for 12 years. And during the war, he did collaborate with the Japanese when they occupied, because they said they would support him in terms of eventual independence. In 1945, he, along with Hatta, declared independence, but it was not achieved until 1949. But he ruled until 67. He established an autocratic system, which is called guided democracy. Interesting, if you look at Russia under Putin, same thing. It's a democracy, right? They say, he says, but it's a guided democracy, controlled totally by one party. 1955, he helped to launch the non-aligned nations movement in Jakarta. And have you ever heard of that, the non-aligned? Well, you know, the Cold War, these countries had to kind of choose between the US and allies or the Russians and allies, which put them in a terrible position. So he said, we're not going to choose either. We're going to form a group of nations where we'll call ourselves non-aligned. We're not going to get on one side or the other of this. Now, interestingly enough, it last met in Kampala, Uganda in 2024. That was last year. So it's still going pretty strong. He, however, lead ever closer to the USSR and China and communism through his long reign. So eventually he was overthrown by a man named Suharto, and he ruled in Indonesia for 32 years, 1967 to 98. He was an army general. He overthrew Sukarno in 1965. He eliminated the communists and sympathizers. Most estimates are 500,000 to 1 million people were slaughtered. Interesting, because if you were Chinese, then you were in big trouble because you were associated with China and Mao Zedong and so on. So many, many, many Chinese were killed, but not many of them also became Christian because that was one way to escape the purge. You know, I'm a Christian. Well, the Holy Spirit works in interesting ways, right? And eventually, you know, so they and their kids became truly converted to Christianity. He oversaw significant industrialization of Indonesia, economic growth, and improved education. He ushered in what he called the New Order. You remember Roosevelt had the what? The New Deal. This was the New Order. A strong, centralized, and military-dominated authoritarian regime, which was also massively corrupt. He and his wife embezzled, the estimate is from 15 to 35 billion dollars, which is stashed in Switzerland and elsewhere. She was known as Madam 10% because she was all involved in this and demanded a 10% kickback on whatever contracts they went out. But because the government was fairly stable and anti-communist during the Cold War, we supported him, and the West did, politically and economically. Well, finally it got to the point where the younger generation grew up and they said, no more of this. And they started to rebel in 1998, had huge riots. This is just about when we were planning, that was when we were planning to go there. And Reska's mother watching this on television saying, you're going there, you better not go there. So in 98, he was forced to resign. And to his right, to his left is Habibie, Yosef Habibie, who was the vice president, and he succeeded him. And he was the total opposite to Suharto. He only was president for less than a year because he liberalized the press and the political party laws. He ended the occupation of East Timor, which Indonesia had occupied, and he held elections 3 years earlier than he could have in order to make sure that people wanted him or whatever, or his party, that would be the Golkar party, to stay in power. Well, of course, he lost the election because of it, but he was a good man. Well, then it came down to the election between Abdurrahman Wahid, people know him as Gus Dur, and Sukarno's daughter, Megawati Sukarno Putri. She had a grandmother in Bali who was a Hindu. So the whole of Bali was for the PDI, her party, and so on. And her party won the majority of the votes, but there were many, many parties, and I think they won 37% of the vote. Well, all her followers assumed that, well, she'll be the president, because there was not direct election. You elected the National Assembly, and they elected the president and the vice president. Well, Dur was a smart guy, and he made a coalition of Muslim parties, and ended up he became the president. Well, our island erupted into riots. They closed down the airport. They tore up all the stoplights, and they burned our exchange outside of our phone exchange, 5,000 phone exchange, turned over a bus in front of our church and burned it, and so on. And so Bali was in chaos, and Gus Dur was very astute. So the next day, he announced that Megawati Sukarno Putri would be the vice president. So that calmed everything down. But he was only president for 2 years, 1999 to 2001. He was a liberal Muslim. He pushed interfaith dialogue, lifted the ban on Chinese New Year, and established Confucianism as the sixth official religion. He protected minority rights, and he even planned to go visit Israel on a peace mission, But that was too much for a lot of people, so plus he was legally blind, but he was able to function, but he was legally blind. So they impeached him. And guess who got to be president? In 2001, there was an election, and Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. He was president from 2004 to 2014, so he had 2 terms as president. He was an excellent president. He was a retired general, but he ended the Aceh insurgency, which had been a civil war going on in the north of Sumatra for decades. And he launched a vision for change, prosperity, peace, justice, and democracy. His goals were to reduce poverty, create jobs, increase the purchasing power for the average Indonesian, and rebuild the infrastructure. Under his term, 10 years, 7% per year economic growth, revived small and medium-sized enterprises, rooted out corruption. He was a respected leader on the world stage. There was political stability, legal reforms, tax reforms, labor reforms, and he attracted a lot of foreign investment. So Indonesia really prospered. Then Joko Widodo, he was elected in 2014 and served 2 terms to 2024. He was the first non-military or non-dynastic president. He was a popular man of the people, and he was extremely popular and efficient president. He focused on economic growth and infrastructure development, launched ambitious health and education agenda, resisted calls for constitutional amendment to allow him to run for a 3rd term. Everybody wanted him to run for a 3rd term, except him. But he said, no, that will introduce chaos again in this country. So, and the 2024 election, that was last year, saw a return to dynastic and military politics. Now you see here Sukarno, and then Megawati Sukarno Putri, his daughter, and now they were running her daughter, his granddaughter, the 1/3 down, for president. Well, Prabowo Subianto, was the other candidate. And as he looks, he was a retired army general. And he had married Suharto's daughter. And unfortunately, well, I should say before that, he had run twice for president and lost twice to Widodo, the president that was now stepping down. But he disputed the results of both elections that led to violence. But then he made a deal with Widodo to accept Widodo's son as his vice presidential running mate. He was his father was an economist who served the former president, Sukarno's minister for the economy, and Suharto's minister for research and technology. So between the combination of military supporters, Suharto's supporters, and Widodo's supporters, he got elected. So he revived really the military and dynastic policies. He was a right-wing nationalist. He was dishonorably discharged from the military in 1998 and banned from entering the USA for committing human rights violations. So there's an erosion of the democratic base and rising corruption and tilting the economy towards the upper class and trying to do a balancing act now between China and the USA. So we will have to wait to see how he does, but he's not a very savory character. So that's who's in charge today. Now, what about the Christian faith at this point? In this map, you can see that it says this is Islam. So, of course, as I said, 87% of the country is Muslim. Protestantism is the blue. So in North Sumatra, amongst the Batak tribes, is a heavily Protestant, and along some of the Rio Islands here. And then way up in Borneo, a heavy Protestant area, some Protestants in here, and in these islands. And Sulawesi, there's even a seminary and a lot of Christians there. And then in Papua New Guinea, there's a lot of Protestants. And West Timor is another big center. And then you have the Hindus, and a few in here, but Bali is heavily Hindu, 87%. This is so the Christians make up 10.5% in Indonesia today. 3% are Roman Catholic. Here you see the main cathedral in Jakarta. And Protestants are 7.3%, many of them Methodists. And then, as I said, North Sumatra has the 7th highest percentage of Christians, 31.6 in the island. This was the Wesley Memorial Church that we served in 1998. And while we were there, they had the elections in 1948. 48 parties running, trucks of young people and loudspeakers all over the place. We made plans to maybe get down by rope from where we were in case. And everybody thought there was going to be a lot of trouble. Jimmy Carter and his team came to oversee the election. And on election day, our pastor and the head of the youth organization and several of the office people cast their first ballot in their lifetime for president of Indonesia. And we went around walking in the neighborhoods, and people would say, "Oh, you must be with Jimmy Carter." And they were having picnics and landowners, "Come on, sit down," and whatever. So it went very well, and there was no violence, so we were relieved. So, and when we were serving there, this was visiting a community of blind people who had children, but they had never seen them, and giving them rice and so on. Because a lot of them were masseuses who would go around blowing a whistle and give people massages and so on. But now, because of the situation they were in, their business had gone way down, so they needed money. Oh, and one of them, you know, they identify you by feeling your face. And one of them said, "Oh, you have such a big nose." And we supported people in the village. They were trans-migrants. That was a government program to send people from Bali and Java, were overpopulated islands, to other islands that had less population, give them some land and get them started there. And the church supported them. And then, of course, we had served in Bali, as we said. Bali, 87% Hindu, 3.5% Muslim, 10% Christian. And the 10% Christian was largely due to this man, Bishop Wayan Mastra. He became a Christian, a long story, because I don't have time to tell, but became a Christian when he was a young person studying in another island. Came back, didn't even dare tell his parents, but started to slowly reach out to people and help them with their needs, and then witness to them. And out of that came this whole church today. It's a custom in Indonesia. At the end of our service, we always everybody came up front, and we had the contextualized service, and came up front, and you got a flower to put in your ear and a blessing. And that's the custom. Notice I have on a white preaching jacket, which Hindu priests all wear white. So Bishop Mastra was very big on indigenization and contextualization. And so this church has been described as the mango tree church. In other words, planted in the native soil of Bali, and trying to utilize Balinese dress and art and as many concepts as possible to build bridges between the Christian faith and Hinduism. So again, this was a church there from the outside. And this is the map of the Balinese church, 12,000 members and 72 congregations. And thousands more on other islands who went on the transmigration program. So they went to other islands as Christians and started Christian communities there. This is the headquarters of the DKBB, or the Gereja Bali Protestant, or the Christian Protestant Church in Bali today. Well, that was taken in 2022. They were very big in education. The church has created many different educational institutions: preschool, kindergarten, elementary schools, high schools. It operates 7 orphanages in different parts of Mali. And it operates a hotel and restaurant training school, 1,500 students that were educated to work in the tourism industry. This is a picture of the bishop and students at John Calvin Seminary on Bali. And I told you before that this church has Reformed roots, actually. This is Mahabodha Marga, which means main road to prosperity, run by the church. It helps underprivileged people in Bali to try to improve their community's economy. Programs such as climate change adaptation, HIV AIDS prevention, permacultural, sexual reproductive health, and disaster response. As I said, most of the villages have built them. They've created a model farming project where people learn how to make their work as farmers much more productive. They learn new and profitable ways of animal husbandry, as well as farming methods. They've had training programs for vocational skills, including such things as tailors and office skills. They've even started their own bank in order to make low-cost loans available to people who need some capital to develop their business projects. They have an irrigation project in West Timor that we were privileged to visit. And the little short guy in the Indonesian church is named Teti, a dynamo for Christ. And he worked as the telephone exchange operator for a huge resort. And everybody knew Teti, and his wife were members of our church. Another interesting story about his wife, I don't have time, but in Bali, you can't get married unless you're of the same faith. And so he was from West Timor, and his wife was Hindu from a village in Bali. And she became a Christian and was baptized at the wedding. But then her family put her spirit in the temple of the dead in the village and put a curse on her. And she became pregnant, thought she was dying. He came to me for help. I went to call. I said, has she been to the doctor? No, he can't afford it. I said, well, we'll help. And then he came back and says, she's pregnant. And they had a beautiful son. Well, today, Indonesia is moving from developing to developed country. This is Jakarta today, the capital. They have a young and energetic population. So demographically, they're not going downhill. They have plenty of resources, natural resources. They've evolved a relatively stable democratic government. And it has a well-developed infrastructure and economy. They had 5% economic growth last year. We're struggling for what, 1.5, I think. It has a well-educated and literate population. It has made progress in religious toleration. While we were there were terrible attacks on Christians in churches and burnings and all of that, and bombings later, and that all now is in the past. They've really made a lot of progress in helping people of different faiths live together peacefully. And it's managed to keep its balance in foreign policy, especially between China and the US. It's not aligned. So Indonesia, in my view, has a bright future if it can maintain political stability, maintain economic growth, quell secessionist movements, and avoid ethnic and religious conflict. This is St. Joseph's Church in Jakarta. No, Denpasar, Bali, the capital, Denpasar. And the Christian minority is still a minority, 10-point-something%. It faces an uphill battle in a sense, but it's a vibrant community and very influential in many respects. There are a lot of Christians in places of authority, and in terms of percentage-wise, much higher percentage than they are in the population. So continue to pray for Indonesia, and especially the Christians there in your witness. Thank you very much. Time for questions, comments.
I'm really impressed by how the interfaith diversity is upheld. What languages do kids learn in school? And I'm curious about your wife too. What language, did she speak Dutch as a child, or her grandparents did, but she didn't? Or I'm wondering how languages work with all this.
So my parents learned Dutch, but there is a main trade language, not only for Indonesia, but broader. Okay, so that was a more universal language in those many islands, as much as people were interacting with others, but you have tons of dialects. For Southeast Asia. In other words, you had a language that developed, so the people of these islands and into Malaysia could communicate with each other because you had a lot of trade and stuff going on. So you had to have a means to communicate. So my parents knew that language and then a more local dialect. Again, you can imagine with all these islands, you're going to have a lot of difference that way. Now, interestingly, my folks were also educated in English, French, German, just as the Europeans were.
Oh, I forget, I don't need that. Bahasa Indonesia is the official language. And that's taught in all of the schools. But they also teach a lot of English. So many people know how to speak English, especially on a place like Bali, for example, in the tourist areas. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, another one.
You started out as an RCA missionary, probably to Taiwan or maybe
Taiwan,
mainland China, but
Taiwan.
it seemed like you ended up as a United Methodist Church. How did that all happen? Why did the RCA maybe drop support for you, or
Well,
can you go into as much as you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I'm an honorary Lutheran, I'm an honorary Methodist, and I'm a Reformed Church in America pastor, and I'm a Christian Reformed raised person. Oh yeah, Presbyterian, yeah. So they had called the Volunteer Mission Program in Indonesia that they recruited retired pastors from other denominations to come and help these projects in these churches. And that's how we had attended a consultation there for pastors in East Asia a couple of years before, and that's how they got to know us and called us to do that. But the Reformed Church, after I was pastor at Union Church in Hong Kong, and we were called to Indonesia, the Reformed Church continued to support us there. Yeah. So, when we went to Florida, we belonged to the Presbyterian Church in Green Cove Springs near us, and I was on the session and I preached and I wrote to the Holland classes, is this okay? Can I do this? Yeah, okay, they said. And then the Presbyterians, I said, is this okay? Will you allow me to do this? Yeah, that's okay. So, yes.
I was wondering if you knew why a lot of Moluccans immigrated to the Netherlands.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's the last place the Dutch were forced to give up. So all the rest of Indonesia became independent, but they still controlled that area in the Moluccas. And under a lot of pressure from the US and the United Nations, the Netherlands finally agreed that they would withdraw from there. Well, when they did, a lot of those people traditionally had become Christians in that area. So they're going to get swallowed up in this Muslim country. Don't remember, this is in the 40s when it was tough to be a Christian anywhere. So a lot of them, out of fear for their religious and their economic livelihood, immigrated to the Netherlands. That's why in the Netherlands you can go to all kinds of Indonesian restaurants and get a rijsttafel, which means you get a feast on the table. Yeah.
Haven't had a rice toffel. It is fabulous.
Yeah.
Wendell, I'm just curious, is there a significant Indonesian population that are expatriates in other countries?
Well, the Netherlands, as I said, but yeah, there are Indonesians in quite a few places, but not lots of them. No.
The reason I ask is 2 years ago, I served for a month as the visiting pastor preacher in the Protestant church in Oman. And while there, I was asked to officiate a wedding. And the bride was Filipina and the groom was Indonesia, and they were both in the Indonesian. They were both in the hospitality industry. So I was just curious about that.
There are a good number of Indonesians in Hong Kong as servants from the Philippines and from Indonesia mainly. And that was one of the battles we fought there, along with others, to give them some kind of rights, because the Philippines has been the poor man of Asia for a long time, despite we having ruled there, for a long time. And so a lot of these women come to Hong Kong, they're recruited, and they pay a big deposit to the recruiter, who shows them a video of the wonders of Hong Kong and life there and how much money. They get there and they discover that their taskmasters not only want them to work in the house, but also illegally in the office. And some of them were given like the top of a refrigerator to sleep on. I mean, that's an extreme case, but we're given, and they were not given the time off they were supposed to be given, and so on. So the churches, we went to work and got labor legislation passed and so on, but we had a Chinese woman in our Union Church congregation told me, I've met an Indonesian worker at the garbage can today, and she told me she had not been allowed out ever since she got there, except to take the garbage out. So she says, I'm like a slave, and so I said, okay, will you meet her at the garbage can and we'll abduct her. And we did, and then we got a lawyer, and the owner, her employer, young Chinese, wealthy, and they had to come to this hearing, and they had to pay her all the back wages they owed her, etc. and so on. Okay, fine, but then you have to go to, we went to the Indonesian consulate, and they were in it too, because they said, oh, okay, well, she has to go to the second floor and sign some papers. I said, okay, I'll go with, no, you can't go there. I said, well, what is she going to sign? Well, that's up, I said, no, she's not signing it. And so finally they gave her a visa to go back to Indonesia. But even then, there are people in Indonesia waiting on that side, saying, yeah. So it's very tough for them. But there are like 28,000 of these Filipino and Indonesian workers. And there are some, in the Middle East. Yeah. And they send the money back to their families and so on. But we had one case, we had a Filipino fellowship and a service for them in the afternoon and so on. And a Filipino pastor woman who helped. And they came one Sunday, and I was preaching at that. They said, there's a woman named Connie, and she's got cancer, just discovered it. And the family's just kicking her out because she's a bad omen, and they're afraid they're going to get, a bad thing in their house and so on. There's nowhere to go. So we said, we'll take her. So we did, and eventually she was able to get the treatment she needed and got back to the Philippines.
I was going to say that was the crux. If she went back to the Philippines right away, she would not have had the treatment for her cancer. So once that was accomplished and she was okay, then we were able to give her a sewing so she could go back home and support her son. Her husband had been killed, and so she went back.
Well, as I said on the program in Hong Kong, the Christian Industrial Committee was formed years ago to fight for laborers and their rights. And so they also developed in our parsonage at Kowloon Union Church, didn't need that building anymore, so they turned it into a halfway house for Filipino or Indonesian maids who got kicked out or whatever. It used to be if they got kicked out, they were deported immediately back to their own country. Well, they owed all this money and they hadn't gotten paid properly and so on. So eventually, when we had a full-time lawyer, and then eventually the government got pressured into changing a lot of laws. And so that was helpful.
Wendell, that's
Oh.
me. While the experiences you've had have been quite varied and the circumstances in each place where you lived likewise varied depending upon the time of the century, so to speak, and how things evolved, do you have any, what do you say, preference or place of those that you liked better than the others? Or do you not want to make a judgment?
Well, each place was unique, and each place had its challenges and its blessings. So I wouldn't say one place is over against another. It's just that they were different. And we learned a lot from people and living with them and had a lot of blessings from them, which is usually the case, right? When you go to serve the Lord, you get blessed. So, yeah, and like in Taiwan, it broke our heart to not be able to go back. And I still have some of my heart is there. And fortunately now the circumstances have totally changed and that regime is pretty well out. And it's a pretty democratic but yeah, now it faces new challenges. So we're still very concerned about the people there and about what's going to happen in the church. Hong Kong, we did 4 months in Thailand to help start a church for Chinese exiles in Bangkok at the end of 2023. And we were able to visit Hong Kong, and I had lunch, as I think I told you, with a Basel missionary who had been active in the Christian Industrial Committee and so on, visiting his colleagues in prison every week and saying he was going to leave Hong Kong after 50 years. It just was no different than a Chinese citizen in terms of, and they just passed another thing last week saying that anybody in the legislature in Hong Kong or in any kind of public position could not say anything to criticize not only the government in Beijing, but the government in Hong Kong, or there would be penalties. And some of them for, gradation of infractions to where you could even be in prison. So each place has its blessings and its challenges.
Are there some places some situations rather, that you really struggled whether to get involved or say something that you can share or feel comfortable sharing?
Oh, yeah, sure. Like in Taiwan, I didn't do anything that I wasn't asked to do by the local people because it would endanger them. But yeah, you had this whole struggle about why am I here? Well, I'm here to share the good news of Christ, basically, right? And then to get involved in these issues would jeopardize my possibility of being there and so on. So my wife and I talked this over and prayed about it and said, the gospel, as I said before, is annunciation and denunciation. And I see my Taiwanese colleagues in these terrible situations and say, well, I'm going to protect my visa. No way. So the holistic gospel involves all of this. So yeah, you try to be as circumspect as you can and careful as you can. But yeah, and sometimes I had to lie. It was hard to do. Somebody in a travel agency, I was going for a visa, and I go back to the States for referral. He said, you met with so-and-so who was the legislator and opposing the Pullman job at your office at night, right? I said, no. Where'd you get this from? I mean, that's hard to do. But so, yeah. And then in China, of course, yeah, you have to be careful. And the people there, like H. Jing, who was the leader of the Protestant church for 60 years there. He talked with us and he said, you know, it's very hard to walk this line between adhering to the basic truth of the gospel and yet not offending the regime. So that's where we were too in China. What do you do? So anyway, yeah, it's difficult at times, but I feel that it's not right for missionaries to be in a country like Ethiopia, for example, and support Haile Selassie. He's a dictator. He became a dictator. So you need to do whatever, but not to endanger the local people as carefully as you can, and do what they ask you to do. Like I was involved in helping to write the first statement that the Presbyterian Church made in 1971 in Taiwan about the fate of our nation. And they wanted to make sure that you could read in between the lines. They couldn't overtly state everything, but implied. Well, they did that in Chinese, but now what about English? So I got called to the church office at 11 o'clock at night, and there were all the general secretary and everybody said, would you help us do this? And then get it out to the world, which I had to be, you know, harmless as a dove and wise as a serpent. Or is that? So, yeah, regrets? No. Blessings? Yes. Thankfulness to the Lord? Yes.
Thank you for four very, very informative sessions. As we've mentioned, and I'll work on this with Amy and Hannah this afternoon.
The one on Indonesia.
Yeah, we're going to send everyone, both in the classroom, but also online, an email so that if you choose to order any of Wendell's books, you may order those directly from him. Okay, so that should be forthcoming. Just watch your email inboxes. And again, thanks for your participation, both here in the classroom and
These
online. And
books
thank you, Mike.
Had the
for your
history and the culture and all that, plus my involvement. So it's not just Wendell did this or that, but the main focus is what about the people and the churches, what was going on and how they lived and what was. Oh,
An unsolicited endorsement. So thank you. All right. Have a great day.
yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Hold on. Yeah. So I'll go in my inbox.
Yeah, okay.